What would you do if the woman you love was kidnapped by a ruthless mafia and they demanded $5 million for her release? And not just for her life, but for her virginity? With time running out, would you pay the ransom or risk everything to save her? As the mafia's sinister plot unravels, one man must decide how far he's willing to go for love. Can money buy safety? Or is there something far more powerful at stake? If you're hooked by this intense tale of love, betrayal, and high stakes, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Stay tuned for more gripping twists that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Alexander Grant was a name that echoed in the business world. A billionaire entrepreneur, known for his razor-sharp mind and ruthless strategies, he had built his empire from the ground up. His presence in any room commanded attention, with his tailored suits and icy demeanor leaving an impression. But behind that cold exterior, there was one thing that softened Alexander's heart: Sophie Winters. Sophie was everything Alexander wasn't. Where he was calculated, she was intuitive. Where he was focused on power, she was focused on people. A striking woman, not just beautiful, but fiercely intelligent. Sophie had captivated him from the moment they met at a charity gala years ago. Her infectious laugh and genuine warmth contrasted Alexander's world of backstabbing deals and cutthroat business. She was his escape from the brutal reality of his empire, his one source of peace. But Sophie wasn't just a beautiful face. She had a mysterious past, one she never spoke of, one that Alexander never pried into. It didn't matter. She was his everything, and he was hers. Their engagement had been the talk of the town, an ideal match on paper, the billionaire and his elegant fiancée. But Sophie's life was more than it appeared. She harbored secrets, and as much as Alexander tried to shield her from the darkness of his world, the truth was, danger had always been lurking. It happened in the blink of an eye. One moment, Sophie was at the cafe on the corner of Fifth Avenue, meeting a friend for lunch. The next, a black SUV screeched to a halt outside the cafe, and masked men stormed in, pulling Sophie from her seat. The noise, the confusion. People screamed and scrambled, but it was too late. The men had Sophie in their grip, dragging her outside and into the vehicle before anyone could react. By the time the police arrived, the car was already gone, swallowed up by the city's chaotic streets. Alexander's phone buzzed just moments later, his assistant's voice trembling on the other end. "Mr. Grant, it's Sophie. She's been taken." The words hit Alexander like a freight train, and for the first time in years, the billionaire felt the ground beneath him shake. He slammed the phone down and rushed out of his penthouse, his mind racing. No one could get to Sophie, not on his watch. He had built an empire, taken on rivals that would have crushed lesser men, and faced every danger imaginable. But nothing could prepare him for the cold terror that flooded his veins when he thought of Sophie in the hands of strangers. Hours passed, with no news. Alexander's anxiety swelled as he coordinated with law enforcement and hired a private investigator to track down any leads. He was furious, angry at himself, angry at the world. Sophie had always been his world, his soft spot in an otherwise unforgiving existence. To think that someone would dare take her from him felt like a violation beyond anything he had ever experienced. Then, as the night began to fall, the phone call came. The voice on the other end was deep, raspy, and cold. "Mr. Grant," the voice began, "we have your fiancée." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice low and tight with fury. The man on the other end chuckled darkly. "We'll get to that. You'll have to listen carefully, Mr. Grant. We want $5 million. You'll bring it to the location we'll provide. No police. No interference." The words were sharp, like a blade cutting through Alexander's composure. "And if I don't pay?" Alexander growled, clenching his fists, trying to keep his cool. "You'll never see her again." "But that's not all we want." The silence on the line was thick, suffocating, as Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. "We want more than just money. Mr. Grant," the voice continued, a cruel smirk evident in his tone. "Your fiancée, Sophie. We demand $5 million for her virginity. That's what she's worth to us." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Alexander's mind raced, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. Sophie's virginity? It didn't make sense. Sophie was his fiancée, his equal, his partner. How could anyone demand such a thing? A twisted silence stretched on the line before the voice spoke again, colder this time. "Take it or leave it. You have 48 hours." The phone line went dead. Alexander's mind was spinning. The idea that someone would value Sophie in such a grotesque way made him sick to his stomach. It felt like a mockery of everything they had. He wasn't sure if it was the Mafia's cruel taunt or a deep, twisted game they were playing, but one thing was clear. Time was running out. He had to make a choice. The shadows of the Mafia stretched far and wide across the criminal underworld, a network of fear, corruption, and ruthless power. At the head of this empire stood Viktor Dragunov, a name that sent chills through anyone who knew of him. Born into the chaos of the Russian Mafia, Viktor had clawed his way to the top with a cold efficiency that mirrored the icy depths of his soul. His empire spanned continents, with fingers in every illegal pie imaginable. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking, and more. He ruled through terror, leaving nothing but ashes in his wake. But it wasn't just power that motivated Viktor. It was personal. Viktor Dragunov had once been a low-level associate in the criminal world. That was until he crossed paths with Alexander Grant. Years ago, Alexander had unknowingly exposed one of Viktor's most lucrative schemes, a series of high-stakes money-laundering operations. A move that left Viktor not only financially ruined but publicly humiliated. Since that moment, Dragunov had sworn vengeance against Alexander, a vendetta that simmered quietly, waiting for the right time to strike. When Sophie Winters came into Alexander's life, Viktor had seen it. The perfect leverage, the fiancée of a billionaire, beloved by the media, living an ideal life. She was an untouchable pawn, and Viktor would make her the key to finally bringing Alexander to his knees. The phone call came through again, this time a few hours after the initial demand. The voice on the other end was the same, deep, chilling, and methodical. "Mr. Grant, I trust you are considering our offer." Alexander gripped the phone tightly, his knuckles turning white as fury boiled beneath the surface. "Where is she?" he demanded, not bothering with pleasantries anymore. Viktor Dragunov's voice crackled through the line, as cold and unfeeling as ever. "She's safe, for now. But every second you waste, Alexander, is another second she spends in our care. You don't want to test me. We can make her suffer. We've done it before." The threat hung heavily in the air, and Alexander's jaw clenched. Sophie's safety was hanging by a thread, and the weight of her life felt like 1,000 tons pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the words wouldn't stop. "What do you want, Dragunov? You have your money. What is this about?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Viktor's voice broke the silence, dripping with malice. "It's not about the money, Mr. Grant. It's about power, control, the price of her virginity. It's a symbol, a statement. You, with all your wealth and influence, will bow down to the likes of me." Alexander was silent for a long moment, his mind spiraling. His thoughts raced back to Sophie, the woman he had loved, the woman who had brought warmth into his otherwise cold existence. Her value wasn't just physical. She was more than any amount of money. To think of her being reduced to this grotesque auction of her body, it made him sick. But this wasn't a negotiation. It was a warning, a reminder of just how far Viktor would go to destroy him. His fingers trembled, his mind pulling in two directions: the desperate need to save Sophie and the unbearable weight of what it meant to meet their demands. Paying the ransom wasn't just about the money. It was a concession, a surrender of his dignity, a sign of weakness that could unravel everything he had worked for. But there was no other choice. Days passed, but with each one, Sophie's situation grew more dire. The Mafia's threats escalated, each call more violent, each message more graphic. They sent photographs of Sophie bound and bruised, her eyes filled with terror. They promised worse with each hour he delayed. The pressure was mounting, and Alexander felt it crushing him. He wasn't just fighting for her freedom anymore. He was fighting for her very survival. He spent sleepless nights in his office, staring at the photos, feeling the weight of the decision he would soon have to make. The billionaire who had outwitted every competitor, crushed every obstacle in his path, was helpless in the face of a man like Viktor Dragunov. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt like he was out of his depth. He walked the halls of his penthouse, every step heavy with doubt. Would paying the ransom be enough? Would Sophie be safe once he handed over the money? Or would it only escalate the violence, drawing him deeper into Victor's world? The unknown terrified him more than anything else. Sophie was everything to him. Her life, her safety, her future. It was all he cared about now. At times, he considered taking matters into his own hands. His power, his resources. He could eliminate Dragunov. He had done it before, many times. But this wasn't just about taking out a rival. It was about Sophie. Every choice he made could cost her everything. A risky move could put her in more danger. And so, as the clock ticked down, Alexander found himself cornered, unable to escape the trap that had been set for him. The Mafia had him exactly where they wanted him. The ransom was the price of Sophie's freedom, but it was also the price of his own soul. He had no choice but to pay. He couldn't lose her. As Alexander prepared to meet the Mafia's demands, the decision weighed heavily on him. He was about to part with $5 million for something so grotesque, so horrific, that it seemed unimaginable. But he would do it. For Sophie, he would sacrifice anything, even his pride, his dignity, and his empire. Nothing mattered more than her. The days were growing shorter, the air colder, and as the ransom deadline loomed closer, Alexander's resolve hardened. His love for Sophie would see him through. There was no amount of money, no demand too great for the woman who had given him everything. The cold, damp room felt like a tomb. Sophie sat against the wall, her hands bound tightly behind her back, the harsh ropes digging into her skin. Her wrists throbbed with pain, but she ignored it. The bruises on her face, the blood caked in her hair, the fear crawling in her veins, all of it was secondary to the thought that still echoed in her mind. Alexander will come for me. The Mafia had been relentless. They had toyed with her, using every method of intimidation they could think of. Every time she resisted, they punished her, pushing her to the edge of what she could endure. They wanted her broken, but Sophie wasn't broken. She refused to be. She would not let them win. Not like this. She couldn't. She wouldn't become their victim. Though she was terrified, Sophie had always been resilient. Her entire life had been a battle, one that she'd fought in silence, never letting anyone see the scars hidden deep inside. She had a past that she kept buried, one that Alexander knew nothing about. Her love for him had been pure, free from the darkness that had always followed her like a shadow. But the past had a way of catching up with you. And now Sophie was facing the ghosts of her own history. As she sat in the cold room, flashes of memories surged through her mind, threatening to overwhelm her. Her childhood had been far from the fairy tale she had always wished for. Born into a broken family, Sophie had learned from an early age how to protect herself. She was the daughter of a man who had once been a powerful figure in the criminal world. Someone Alexander would have considered a threat to his empire. Sophie had never known her mother, a casualty of a dangerous life that Sophie's father had dragged them both into. By the time she was a teenager, Sophie had become the caretaker of her father, who had fallen deep into addiction and debt. It was a life filled with betrayal, fear, and survival, and it was a life that had shaped her into the woman she had become. She'd left that life behind when she met Alexander, determined to escape the chaos. She had worked hard to reinvent herself, to live a life far removed from the darkness of her past. Alexander had been her escape. His world, while dangerous in its own way, was one she could trust. She loved him, not for his wealth or his power, but for the peace he brought into her life, for the kindness he showed when no one else did. Now, that peace seemed like a distant memory. In the dim light of her cell, Sophie pulled her knees to her chest and closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Her mind was sharp. She had always been a fighter, and in this moment, she needed every ounce of that strength. She had to survive. She had to make it out of here. How do I survive? She asked herself, the question gnawing at her. How do I escape? The Mafia had their demands. 5 million. They had taken her because of him, because of Alexander. They had taken her because they knew he would pay anything for her, that he would sacrifice everything for her. She could already see him, pacing in his penthouse, preparing to make the deal. He was a man of action, but even he would struggle with the decision they had forced upon him. But Sophie couldn't let him pay. She couldn't allow herself to be the price of a ransom, the object of some twisted transaction. She had to find a way out. Every inch of her body screamed for help, but her mind was clear. She had to outsmart them. She had to wait for the right moment. Sophie glanced around the room, her eyes scanning for any means of escape. The walls were bare, save for the rusted chains hanging from the ceiling. The window was small, too high to reach. There was no way out, unless she could make one. Her mind raced. She needed to find a weakness, something she could exploit. Think, Sophie. Think. In her mind, she replayed every conversation, every interaction she'd had with the Mafia. They weren't invincible. They had to make mistakes. She could use that. She wasn't powerless, no matter how trapped she felt. But then, just as the first glimmer of hope began to spark in her chest, something shifted. Sophie's instincts, honed by years of surviving in a world of chaos, told her something wasn't right. The Mafia wasn't just using her to get to Alexander. She realized, with a sudden sickening clarity, that they wanted more than money. They weren't interested in just breaking Alexander's spirit. They were after something far darker. Sophie had heard whispers, odd, cryptic comments from her captors, things that hadn't made sense at first. They were speaking in code, referring to a deal and payment that went beyond money. But now it clicked. It was about power. It was about control. Sophie wasn't just a pawn in a game for her fiancé's fortune. They had plans for her beyond this. They were using her as bait, manipulating Alexander to get to something far more valuable than money. Sophie's heart sank as she realized the terrifying truth. They were going to use her to break Alexander, to turn him into one of them, and if they couldn't, they would destroy him. The thought made her sick to her stomach, but it also fueled her resolve. She wouldn't let them turn her into a tool for their vendetta. Sophie's love for Alexander, her desire to protect him, became the fire that kept her going. She had to escape. She had to warn him. She had no idea how, but she would fight. She would survive. For him, Sophie's heart pounded with renewed determination. She would outsmart the Mafia. She would show them just how far her willpower could go. The tension in Alexander's mind was unbearable. The clock ticked on, each passing minute a reminder of how little time he had left. The Mafia's demand, $5 million for Sophie's release, loomed over him like a dark cloud. He had tried everything he could think of. Lawyers, investigators, private security teams. But every lead, every attempt to find Sophie had led to nothing. And now, with the deadline rapidly approaching, Alexander knew that the time for conventional methods had passed. He needed to think outside the box. He needed a plan that would force the Mafia into the open. He assembled a team of specialists, each one hand-picked for their unique skill set. The best hackers, the most seasoned investigators, and even a few men with connections in the darker corners of the world. Alexander's resources were boundless, and now he would use every one of them. This wasn't just a negotiation anymore. It was a war, one he had to win, no matter the cost. They gathered in the war room of his penthouse, a cold, sterile space illuminated by harsh overhead lights. Maps, photos, and dossiers of known Mafia figures covered the walls. A large digital screen flickered to life in the center of the room, displaying names and faces of Dragunov's associates, each one a potential lead. "I need information," Alexander said, his voice calm, but there was an undercurrent of raw determination. "We have no time to waste. Every moment that passes puts Sophie in more danger." The team got to work. But this wasn't the usual search for business intel or competitors. This was personal. The Mafia's web was vast, and Alexander knew he was up against a monster. Viktor Dragunov, the man who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. But what Alexander hadn't realized was just how deep the roots of this network ran. Dragunov's influence spread far beyond just the criminal underworld. He had people in the highest places, and that made tracking him down a monumental task. Days turned into sleepless nights. Alexander paced the floor, his mind a blur of thoughts, his every move calculated with precision. But despite the intensity of the search, the pressure was beginning to crack him. Each report, each update from his team, brought more frustration than hope. He was no closer to Sophie. He was losing control, and the thought of what the Mafia might be doing to her in that moment was like a blade lodged in his chest. The dilemma that gnawed at him, the moral quandary, was beginning to take its toll. Pay the ransom? That would be the safe option. It would guarantee Sophie's release, but it would come at the cost of everything he had fought for. His pride, his empire, his very dignity. It would also send a message to Dragunov that Alexander could be bought, that he could be controlled. But the other option, the more dangerous option, was a course of action Alexander wasn't entirely sure he was ready to take. It meant risking everything, taking out Dragunov, destroying his empire, his network, once and for all. But it would come with consequences. Sophie's life would still be in the balance, and there was no way to guarantee her safety. The thought of losing her forever was enough to stop Alexander's heart cold. He hated this. He hated feeling so powerless. He was a man who controlled industries, who dictated the terms of every deal he made. Yet here he was, cornered, unable to find his way out of this nightmare. The guilt gnawed at him. Every moment he hesitated was a moment Sophie could be suffering. He was her protector. He had failed her. That thought kept him awake at night. The weight of it, suffocating him. Then, as if by some stroke of fate, a breakthrough finally came. The lead was small, a mere blip in the noise of the investigation, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope in Alexander's chest. One of the investigators, a man who had deep connections in the world of organized crime, had uncovered a whisper, a rumor about a safe house on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The more they dug, the more it began to line up. Sophie's location might finally be within reach. Alexander's heart raced as the information came in. He stood up from his desk, his pulse quickening. The plan had begun to fall into place. The safe house was isolated, hidden deep within a rundown industrial complex. No one would think to look there, and that was exactly why it was the perfect place to keep someone like Sophie. But there was no time to waste. The deadline was fast approaching, and Alexander knew that if they were wrong, if they missed this chance, he might never see Sophie again. He issued orders for a tactical strike, preparing to confront the Mafia in their lair. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, relief at the possibility of finding Sophie, but dread at the impending confrontation with Dragunov. This wouldn't be a simple exchange of money. This would be war. The team went silent, knowing that the final moments were upon them. The next 24 hours would decide everything. As Alexander prepared for the confrontation, he couldn't help but reflect on the path that had brought him here. Every decision, every sacrifice had led him to this point. But none of that mattered now. He wasn't fighting for his empire anymore. He wasn't fighting for money or power or prestige. He was fighting for Sophie. And no matter the cost, no matter the risk, he would stop at nothing to bring her back. The night air was thick with tension as Alexander's car screeched to a halt in front of the abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. The place was desolate, shrouded in darkness, save for a flickering light overhead. This was where it would all go down, the moment that would decide Sophie's fate. The deal was simple, in theory. Alexander would bring the $5 million handed over to the Mafia, and in return, they would release Sophie. The world's most expensive transaction. But this was no ordinary exchange. There was no guarantee, no assurances, no trust between them. It was a game of high stakes, where one wrong move could end it all. And Alexander had learned the hard way that trust was a commodity the Mafia didn't deal in. His heart hammered in his chest as he exited the car, his gaze scanning the area. The warehouse was eerily quiet, save for the sound of distant traffic and the crunch of his boots on gravel. His team was stationed at strategic points, their eyes trained on the area, ready for anything. But Alexander's mind was focused solely on Sophie. He had to see her, to know she was alive, to get her out of this nightmare. Nothing else mattered. Not his wealth, not his reputation, only her. He approached the warehouse, the door creaking open as he stepped inside. The dim light inside was almost blinding, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him like the claws of a predator. In the center of the room stood Viktor Dragunov, his cold gaze fixed on Alexander. Beside him was Sophie, her hands bound, her eyes bloodshot and terrified. She was bruised, her once stunning appearance marred by the violence she had endured. But she was alive. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. She was alive. That's all that mattered. "Mr. Grant," Dragunov's voice echoed through the warehouse, low and menacing. "I see you've come alone, as promised. No police. No tricks." Alexander barely acknowledged the Mafia leader. His eyes were fixed on Sophie. He couldn't take his gaze off her. "You have the money. Let her go." Dragunov smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Money, yes. But first, we need to complete the transaction." The Mafia's men stepped forward, a large duffel bag in hand. Dragunov's right-hand man, a hulking figure named Ivan, opened the bag, revealing the stacks of cash inside. Alexander's eyes flickered to it, but his focus remained on Sophie. "We have agreed to your terms," Dragunov said, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Now, the payment." Alexander's fingers tightened around the briefcase he held, the only thing standing between him and Sophie's release. He could feel the weight of the money, the weight of his decision, pressing on his chest. This was supposed to be the end, the final step. He would pay, and Sophie would be free. But nothing about this felt right. The exchange was about to happen. The moment of truth. But then, as if on cue, the situation shifted. There was a faint sound, a click of metal, followed by a shrill, frantic scream. Sophie's body jerked in her restraints, her face contorting in terror as she was pulled roughly toward one of the Mafia men. Her eyes locked with Alexander's, wide with fear. "No!" Sophie cried, her voice trembling as she was yanked away from the safety of the briefcase and pushed toward a shadowy corner. "Please don't!" Alexander's pulse raced. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his voice shaking with both anger and panic. Dragunov raised a hand, silencing him with the cool authority that had come to define him. "I told you, Mr. Grant, this is not about money." It never was. The words hung in the air, sending a chill down Alexander's spine. His mind raced, piecing the fragments together. But before he could react, Sophie was shoved to the ground. A brutal, painful sound echoed through the room as one of Dragunov's men raised a weapon. It was a knife, gleaming in the dim light, and it was aimed directly at Sophie. Time seemed to stop. A life-or-death moment. Sophie, the woman Alexander loved, was seconds away from being lost forever. Without thinking, Alexander surged forward, throwing the briefcase to the floor as his hand instinctively reached for the gun at his side. But in that instant, something unexpected happened. Sophie, despite the blood and bruises, found a sliver of strength within her. With a desperate, primal yell, she lashed out, kicking the man holding her down. The knife missed its mark by inches, and Sophie was able to roll out of his grasp, her body shaking but defiant. The Mafia men reacted quickly, their movements sharp and deliberate. A firefight erupted in an instant, the sound of gunfire filling the space, the violence exploding in all directions. In the chaos, Alexander moved, his body a blur of motion. He reached Sophie, pulling her close to him, his arms shielding her from the hail of bullets that flew dangerously close. He couldn't lose her. Not now. With a fierce determination, Alexander pushed her behind cover, his body covering hers as he protected her with everything he had. The fear, the anger, the desperation, it all coalesced into a single focus: Sophie's safety. Just as the gunfire ceased, a shocking truth came to light. Dragunov's cold laughter echoed from across the room as he approached. "Did you think it was about the money, Alexander?" He mocked, a cruel sneer on his face. "You think this is about some virginal prize? No, no, Sophie was never the ransom. She was the tool, the leverage." Sophie's eyes widened, her pulse pounding in her ears. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The truth is far worse than you could ever imagine," Dragunov continued, his voice dark with malice. "I used her to draw you in, to destroy everything you've built. And now you're paying for it." Alexander's mind reeled as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The Mafia had never wanted Sophie's virginity. They had only used her as bait to tear him apart, to break him emotionally and financially. The $5 million was a ruse. Dragunov's true goal had always been to weaken Alexander, to make him feel the cost of his empire, to strip him of everything that mattered. The cost had been far greater than any money. The fight wasn't over. The gunfire had stopped, but the battle was just beginning. The Mafia's grip on Sophie and Alexander was far from broken. But in this moment of chaos and revelation, one thing remained clear. Love, as Alexander had always known, was the most powerful force in the world. And no matter the cost, he would fight for it. The warehouse was silent now, save for the faint hum of the distant city. The chaos had subsided, the gunfire stopped, and the dust had settled. Dragunov's men were either dead or in custody, and the warehouse stood empty, a hollow shell of its former purpose. Alexander was on his knees beside Sophie, his arms wrapped protectively around her. He could feel her body trembling against his, but she was alive. She was in his arms, and that's all that mattered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sophie, still raw from everything she'd endured, leaned into him, her body shaking from both exhaustion and relief. Her hands were cut and bruised, her face pale, but her eyes were clear. She was alive. "I thought I lost you," Alexander whispered, his voice rough, laden with emotion. His heart hammered in his chest, the weight of everything they had just gone through pressing down on him. But all he could focus on was the woman in his arms, the love of his life. Sophie looked up at him, her lips trembling as tears welled in her eyes. "You didn't lose me, Alex," she whispered back. "I'm right here." It had been a long, torturous journey. Both of them had been tested beyond measure. But in that moment, everything else melted away. The violence, the threats, the fear. All of it became secondary to the profound, unspoken bond they shared. There was no amount of money, no ransom too great, no danger too fierce that could ever sever their connection. In the days that followed, Sophie was hospitalized for her injuries, both physical and emotional. It wasn't just the bruises and cuts that needed tending to, it was the fear, the trauma, the scars that ran deeper than skin. But Alexander never left her side. He stayed with her every step of the way, holding her hand as doctors worked to help her heal. They were a team, always had been, always would be. And through it all, Sophie found solace in his presence, in the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. She had survived, because of him, because of their love. It had been tested in ways neither of them had ever imagined, but it had endured. It wasn't just about the money or the ransom anymore. That had been a means to an end, a twisted plot to destroy Alexander and everything he had worked for. But they had risen above it, and Sophie knew that no amount of wealth or power could ever measure up to what they had now. In the weeks that followed, the Mafia's empire slowly crumbled. Dragunov's downfall was swift and brutal. Alexander's reach and influence were far too great, and his enemies now had no protection. Those who had worked with him scattered, their network dismantled. Justice was swift, but it wasn't the most satisfying part of the story. It wasn't the Mafia's collapse that mattered. It was the healing that had to come next, the rebuilding of their lives. Rebuilding wasn't easy. Sophie had to confront her past, the life she had tried so hard to leave behind. The trauma of being held captive was something that would take time to overcome, and there were days when she questioned whether she could ever be the same. But Alexander was there, every step of the way. He never pressured her to move faster than she was ready to. He understood that this was something they would have to face together, and together they would rebuild. They started small, just the two of them. Quiet nights at home, conversations about their future, the life they wanted to create. Alexander was patient, giving her the time she needed to heal, while reminding her, always, that he was there for her, no matter what. And slowly, as the days turned into months, Sophie began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The scars, while never fully gone, became a part of her story. They didn't define her. They were a testament to her strength, her willpower, and her ability to endure. Their love, once tested by the darkest forces, had emerged stronger than ever. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about thriving, about rebuilding a future together, one where love was the foundation. As they sat together on a quiet evening, looking out over the city they had fought so hard to protect, Alexander held Sophie close. They didn't need words anymore. The silence between them was filled with understanding, with a deep, profound love that needed no explanation. "I don't ever want to lose you again," Alexander whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You won't," Sophie replied softly, her hand resting on his chest. "You'll never lose me." In that moment, Alexander realized that love was never about the money, the luxury, or the power. It wasn't about the things they had fought for or the price they'd paid. It was the bond that existed between them. Unbreakable, irreplaceable. They had gone through hell, and yet they had emerged stronger, together. That was worth more than any fortune. The final twist of the story wasn't in the Mafia's downfall, nor in the ransom, nor in the money Alexander had paid. The twist was in the revelation that no amount of wealth or hardship could ever compare to the love they shared. It was priceless, and as Alexander looked at Sophie, he knew that he would spend every day of his life proving that love was, indeed, the most valuable thing of all.